On the 17th of August 1415, Michael de la Pole, 2nd Earl of Suffolk, marched ashore in Normandy wearing roughly 50 pounds of steel, wool and leather, ready to lay siege to the port city of Harfleur alongside King Henry V. He would be dead within a month. Not from a sword, not from an arrow, not from anything that had anything to do with the armour everyone pictures when they imagine a medieval knight going to war. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what actually killed soldiers on medieval campaign, because the answer is almost never what you think, and the story of one man and his son across 7 weeks in the autumn of 1415 makes that clearer than almost any other example in the historical record. Start with the armour, because the popular image is wrong in a way that matters. A full suit of field plate for a knight of Suffolk's rank typically weighed somewhere between 45 and 60 pounds. That number surprises people who grew up picturing something closer to 200. The difference is engineering. Plate armour by the 15th century wasn't a metal cage bolted around a man. It was a carefully fitted system designed to spread its weight the way a well-made backpack spreads its load, across the shoulders, hips, and limbs, rather than hanging off a single point and grinding everything beneath it. Historians studying English and continental armour of this period have found that a well-fitted harness distributed weight evenly enough that a trained knight could run, roll, climb a ladder, and mount a horse unaided. The image of knights being lowered onto horseback by cranes comes from later theatrical tradition, not battlefield practice. It was never real. Nothing metal touched bare skin. Underneath every plate, a knight wore a gambeson, a heavily padded jacket stitched from anywhere between 15 and 30 layers of linen or wool, sometimes stuffed with raw fleece or horsehair. The gambeson did 3 separate jobs at once. It cushioned impacts so that a mace blow or a poleaxe strike didn't simply transmit its full force straight through the metal into bone. It prevented the plates from grinding against skin during a full day of marching, the same way a backpack's hip belt prevents a pack frame from digging into the spine over 10 miles. And in a cold Norman autumn, it kept a body insulated from steel that would otherwise sit against bare flesh like a block of ice pulled from a river. Getting the whole system on, from linen shirt to the last buckled plate, took a trained knight and his squire somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. A timeline worked out through careful modern reenactment, because the order of dressing was fixed and couldn't be varied without leaving gaps a blade could find. That order is worth understanding. Linen shirt and wool hose first, against the skin. Padded leg coverings over those for the same reason the gambeson covered the torso. Then the plates went on from the ground up. Sabatons over the feet, greaves at the shin, polins at the knee, cuisses on the thighs. By the time a squire was working at his knight's waist, the man already had 2 fully armoured functional legs and could stand through the rest of the fitting instead of lying flat like furniture being assembled. The upper body followed the same logic, working outward toward the extremities, with gauntlets going on last of all because hands were needed for buckles and laces until there was genuinely nothing left to fasten. The armour, in other words, wasn't the problem. The problem was what wearing it for an entire day actually cost a human body. Researchers at the University of Leeds put volunteers on treadmills in accurately reproduced 15th century plate and measured the physiological expense. Walking in full armour required more than twice the energy of walking unencumbered, and it was actually harder than carrying a backpack of equivalent weight because the load wasn't just heavy, it was distributed across the joints in a way that made every stride mechanically more expensive. The lead researcher pointed to Agincourt directly as a case study in this. French knights advancing across a waterlogged field in full plate after having already stood in formation for hours would have been running on metabolic fumes before they ever reached the English line. What the famous accounts describe as English archers cutting down exhausted, barely moving French knights isn't dramatic exaggeration. It's a description of men who had burned through their energy reserves before the contact even happened. Heat was the other side of that equation, and in some ways, the more dangerous one. a closed helmet, trapped the breath a man was already working twice as hard to draw. The same steel that stopped an arrow or turned a blade also stopped any movement of air across the skin. A knight who had been marching since dawn or digging siege works under a late summer sun was carrying a rising core temperature with no reliable way to check it and no way to cool down except stripping off the very thing keeping him alive if the fighting started. Medieval commanders understood this well enough to plan around it where conditions allowed, timing heavy marches for cooler morning hours, rotating troops off watch to rest in shade, pushing water forward to the line whenever the supply lines could manage it. A siege, however, didn't always allow for any of that, and Harfleur in August offered very little flexibility. Suffolk's men didn't even fight that day. They dug. For 6 weeks outside Harfleur, in armour or out of it depending on the threat level at any given hour, the English besieging force built approach trenches, worked their cannon and siege engines into position, and stood watch shifts along a perimeter designed to cut the town off from resupply until its garrison had no choice but to surrender. A night on campaign didn't sleep in full plate. Most stripped the steel off once the immediate threat had settled for the evening and rested in the gambeson alone, sometimes with an additional arming coat for warmth, because getting full armour on and off every 4 hours for watch rotations was its own kind of exhausting labour that no one chose to repeat voluntarily. Tents went up in rows around the command pavilion, officers and knights clustered closer in, archers and labourers spread further out, and a squire's real work began the moment the plates came off. Cleaning mud and rust from the steel before it set, checking every strap and rivet for wear, making sure the whole system would go back on cleanly at the first alarm. Even free of the plate, a body kept running a bill for weeks like that. The same joints the armour had protected all day ached hardest once it came off. The padding that prevented chafing during active movement didn't prevent the slower damage of wearing damp wool and linen against skin for days without a real wash. Men who had been standing watch in flooded trenches came back to camp with feet that hadn't been fully dry since the landing at Chedicos. None of that killed anyone by itself. All of it wore bodies down exactly at the moment when those bodies needed whatever reserves they had for whatever came next. Food on campaign followed its own rhythm, built around what could survive the crossing and what a field kitchen could produce at scale for several thousand men. Fresh bread, when the ovens could be built or hauled into operation, was the best meal the camp offered. More often, men on the march and on the lines ate a twice-baked campaign biscuit, dense and dry enough to last weeks without spoiling, softened in ale or broth before it was worth chewing. Salted meat and dried fish rounded out the ration, the same preservation logic every medieval household used, just scaled up enormously. Wine and ale were distributed as much for hygiene as for morale, because clean water was already the scarcest resource in camp, and it was only getting scarcer as the siege ground on. A knight ate seated on whatever camp furniture had been rigged from timber, gauntlets off and gambesons still on, because the meal was a pause in the labour, not a separate occasion from it. The squire in all of this mattered more than most accounts acknowledge. In the military terminology of the period, a knight wasn't one man. He was a small operational unit organised around one man, the knight himself, a war horse, a riding horse, a pack horse, and at least one squire, sometimes more depending on the wealth of the household. The squire fed his lord, dressed and undressed him, maintained his kit, cared for the animals, managed the logistics of the pavilion, and in a real emergency was the person responsible for getting an injured knight off the field before the enemy reached him. Suffolk had that entire apparatus around him at Harfleur. It wasn't enough. Because 6 weeks in one place, with several thousand men and hundreds of horses packed into a marshy river valley at the height of summer, created a problem that no squire and no armour was designed to solve. There was no clean way to manage what that many bodies produced every single day. Human waste, animal waste, and the carcasses of horses and pack animals that died from exhaustion or illness during the siege all ended up somewhere in proximity to the same water sources the camp depended on. And in the late August heat, that proximity became lethal. Latrines were dug, That's worth saying clearly, because the alternative image of medieval armies simply relieving themselves anywhere is too simple. The trenches were dug at the margins of camp by whatever labour could be spared from the siege works, and there was some attempt at organisation. But a camp that size sitting in the same spot for 6 weeks produced waste faster and in greater volume than field latrines could contain. The marshy ground around Harfleur made the problem structurally worse. Standing water doesn't drain the way dry soil does. What was meant to stay at the margins of camp had nowhere to go. And over days and then weeks it migrated back toward the centre, toward the wells and the streams and the barrels that thousands of thirsty, overheating men were drinking from through every watch cycle. The English called what followed the bloody flux. We call it dysentery. It moved through the English camp at Harfleur faster than any weapon the French garrison had been able to deploy from behind the walls, and it chose its victims with complete indifference to rank. A common archer and an earl in 50 pounds of custom-fitted plate were equally exposed to whatever was in the water, and the disease made no distinction between them. Contemporary accounts of the siege suggest English losses to illness ran somewhere around 2,000 men before the town even surrendered, a number that dwarfed anything the actual military operations at Harfleur produced in casualties.
The war wolf!
Historians who have worked carefully through the surviving muster rolls describe an army reduced by roughly a third, counting the men left to garrison the captured town, the sick shipped back to England, and the dead in camp. Michael de la Pole, 2nd Earl of Suffolk, was one of the dead. He never drew his sword against the French army that would face Henry 2 months later at Agincourt. He died in his tent of dysentery in the same camp where thousands of men around him were working through the same progression of symptoms, while his armour sat nearby doing exactly what it had been built to do, and mattering not at all to the thing that was killing him. His son, also named Michael de la Pole, inherited the earldom on the spot. In the middle of a war camp, 19 years old, suddenly the head of his family and responsible for everything that came with it. He did what the situation required. He stayed. He marched with the army when Henry finally moved out of Harfleur and began the famous chevauchée north toward Calais. 7 weeks after his father died of disease in that camp, the younger Michael de la Pole was killed at Agincourt, one of a very small number of English nobles lost in a battle the English otherwise won so decisively that contemporary French accounts struggled to explain how completely it had gone wrong for them. Father and son, dead within 7 weeks of each other on the same campaign, from 2 entirely different causes. The father from contaminated water in a siege camp, the son from combat in a field battle that history would eventually call one of England's greatest military victories. That gap between them is the whole argument. The armour sounds like the danger when you say the number out loud. 50 or 60 pounds of steel worn all day in the sun on a medieval battlefield sounds like the thing most likely to kill you, whether through exhaustion, overheating, or just the sheer mechanical disadvantage of fighting in it. And those risks were real. The lead study isn't wrong. Heat exhaustion in plate armour during active combat on a warm day could put a man down before any opponent reached him. The risk was genuine, and commanders accounted for it in their planning. But the body count from a campaign like the one that produced Agincourt tells a different story about where most of the actual dying happened. The fighting at Harfleur itself killed a relative handful of men outright, mostly from the dangerous work of running siege machinery close to defended walls and from the occasional sally by the garrison. The disease that grew from a static camp, poor drainage and no working theory of germ transmission killed roughly 2,000 more men than many medieval pitched battles managed to account for in a single afternoon of fighting. This wasn't a surprise to anyone leading armies in the period. Soldiers had their own vocabulary for camp sickness precisely because it was constant, a reliable feature of any siege that lasted more than a few weeks. Armies had been losing more men to disease than to enemy action for centuries before Harfleur, and would continue losing them on the same ratio for centuries after. The pattern repeated at siege after siege across medieval Europe. Assemble enough people in one place for long enough without the infrastructure to manage what they produced and consumed, and the water would do more damage than the garrison's arrows ever could. Henry's own great-grandfather had faced an almost identical situation at the Siege of Calais generations earlier, losing so many men to illness over that campaign that fresh reinforcements had to be shipped across the Channel just to keep the siege lines operational. Harfleur wasn't an anomaly. It was the expected outcome of the conditions. Horses added another layer of complexity that was never really separable from the human cost. A knight's operational capacity was inseparable from his animals. A man of Suffolk's rank travelled with at least 3, a destrier or heavy war horse, a riding horse for travel and a pack horse for equipment. Each animal required significantly more food and water per day than a man did, and the combined demand of thousands of horses concentrated in a river valley accelerated the deterioration of exactly the grazing and water sources the camp depended on. As the siege extended, foraging parties had to range further from the lines to find adequate feed, putting more men outside the relative safety of the perimeter every day. The horses that might carry a knight out of danger were quietly making the water he drank from more dangerous. With every week they remained concentrated in that same low, marshy ground. So picture the complete shape of what Suffolk walked into. 50 pounds of steel, engineered precisely enough that the weight alone wasn't what would kill him. A gambeson doing quiet, unglamorous, essential work against cold and chafe that made the metal above it livable across a full day. A squire running constant maintenance to keep that whole apparatus ready for the alarm that could come at any hour. Real physiological risk from heat and exertion during actual fighting, risk that commanders planned around because they had to. And underneath all of it, present from the first week and growing stronger with every passing day, the actual threat, waiting in the drinking water of a camp that had been sitting in the same spot for 6 weeks in August, with no working solution to what thousands of men and hundreds of horses were leaving behind them every day. Suffolk didn't die the way the armour suggests he should have, cut down in some recognisable act of medieval violence. He died in a tent, from dysentery, the same way roughly 2,000 of the men camped around him did, while the steel that had crossed the Channel with him sat idle and useless against the thing actually ending his life. His son rode into Agincourt 7 weeks later, plate armour and all, and became one of its quieter casualties. A 19-year-old earl still new to the title his father's death had forced on him in the worst possible circumstances. 2 deaths. 1 campaign, 50 pounds of armour with a reputation it only partially deserves, and contaminated water that did the actual work while nobody was watching it.